Hello and welcome. My name is Susan and I have been sharing my daily drawing progress videos with you for the past 3 years on this channel. And in today's video, I want to share with you essentially a demonstration of my daily 20-minute drawing routine. And lately, I have been really into using these highlighters. And primarily these 20-minute drawing sessions, I use 2 different colored highlighters, one warm tone and one cool tone. I also use 2 brush pens. The 2 brush pens that I use, one of them is for the lightest shade possible in portrait sketch, and then the other one I use for depicting the darkest shade, which is in this case a black. For every single portrait study in the beginning, I always use the lightest highlighter, in this case this coral or orange colored highlighter, and just use fairly gestural, figurative loose strokes to depict the boundaries and sort of the main features on her face. And in this step, what I'm trying to depict is just the rough shapes. Right? I don't really care if it's not 100% accurate, but I want to block in some of the shapes that I identify and the primary lines that I want to capture on this model's face. I almost never look at the clock as I'm drawing. A lot of times when I'm in these first initial 2-3 minutes, I'm also very stiff. My hand is stiff, my mind is stiff. I might not be really in the zone yet for drawing. And although I draw every single day, or at least I try to draw every single day, it is incredibly important to know that in the first few minutes, your hand and your eyes are still getting used to it. You need a warm-up session. It's just like an athlete when you're doing sports. You need some time in the beginning to warm up. So that's kind of what I'm using this initial pen for, right? Because I'm not using a pencil, I have to know that I have to be willing to accept that this initial sketch is not going to turn out perfect. I have to accept that the lines I put down are going to be wobbly and they're not going to be the final thing, and that's okay. So there's a certain element of accepting your imperfection in this phase. And I love it because it not only serves as a warm-up for me personally, but it's also a mental thing, right? It's telling myself that it's okay that, during this initial phase, I'm going to create really stupid lines. And these lines are not going to resemble at all what my true intentions are. And that's okay. And even though I don't really time myself, I don't look at my clock or anything, almost always when I look back on my these recorded sessions, I've noticed that I almost never go over the 5-minute mark. So in the initial 3 minutes, I would have already done a decent job at capturing what I want to do with that initial highlighter. So now I move on to the next step, which is using the other highlighter. And again, I'm still fairly gestural. So notice how I'm holding the pen fairly back. I'm not really using the fingers too much. I'm just using my wrist and kind of blocking in certain darker shapes. And that's what I try to do with this marker. I'm using this marker to now, instead of focusing on lines, I'm more focusing on shapes. I'm more focusing on accuracy. And because it's a darker shade, I use this to block in some of the intermediate colors. And I also use this as a way to correct. Because it's slightly darker, I could use it to override the orange color underneath and almost use it as a way to tell myself later on when I'm using the darker shade that, hey, like follow these blue lines instead of the orange lines in the initial sketch. And the way that I think my brain works in particular is just I'm going over the reference photo once more in this step. And sometimes when I'm in this step, I do notice that I've made some fundamental mistakes and it's very hard to correct. So when that happens, I usually just go with it. because I think one of my goals is not really to capture the model's likeness. I mean, I find these models' photos on Pinterest, and for the most part, I don't know who they are. I don't really care who they are either. They're not famous people, and it might be the first time seeing them. So it's not really important for me to capture their likeness. And it's exercise for me lately by using pen sketching to be able to capture their facial expression, their gaze, the values, the shapes on this portrait, right? These are the things I tend to focus on. It's less than the likeness of the model. But most of the time, after I finish drawing, there's certain resemblance, and I'm quite happy with the way that this model turned out. I know that the final result doesn't look like her precisely, but I can still sort of see the likeness. One thing I noticed right now that I'm reviewing it is that I think there should be a little bit more gap between the two eyes, whereas I didn't really capture that attribute on her face. But that's okay. I think the final result, I still quite like it. And one of the things you might have noticed is if I'm overlapping the two shades, and that's on purpose, I always choose a cool tone highlighter and a warm tone highlighter. And the reason for that is because when you overlay them together, you kind of create this muted gray or brown shade, right? And that's a nice that creates a nice shadow effect, even though I'm using highlighters. But because they are warm and cool, when you overlay the warm and cool tone, and because they're complementary colors in this case, you're decreasing the vibrancy of the highlighter. The other thing I'm started to notice with this blue shade is that I've been using it for quite a bit now, and it's running out of ink. So when a highlighter or any pen that you're working with, when it's running out of ink, there's this unique property where you can start to create very interesting effects because it's running out of ink. So in this case, if I flick it, I can create a nice gradient. So you can see that throughout the drawing here, I'm starting to use that. And before, one of the things I always do nowadays is that I tend to capture all the values, the midtones, everything. I tend to lay down the colors essentially down using all the brushes before I start going in with the darkest shade. Because as soon as you go in with the darkest shade, what ends up happening is that the color starts to get a little bit muddier, because once you lay down the black and then you go back in with any other marker, the black is going to blend in, which I do use that towards my advantage at certain times, but I almost always try to lay down kind of like a nice foundation of colors before I go in with the black. So right now what I'm trying to do is I'm just using these two highlighters interchangeably, orange, then blue, then now orange again, just to create some transitions. And I know that when I go over these two markers between one another, the colors do smudge a little bit, and you kind of get this brownish gray color, as I mentioned before. And that's what I use a lot of times as transition. And now I'm going in with this lightest shade. I'm using a Tombow brush pen. I quite like it as well, and it's very light. So I use this to kind of blend in the colors a little bit, especially in the lightest shade. In this drawing in particular, she has quite a strong light on her face, and there's not a lot of shadows. So I'm purposely not going to use a ton of the blue marker, right? The majority of the coverage is going to be light shade. So I use a lot of this Tombow in this drawing, but that's not the case for other drawings that I've done. Most of the time, I think it's 50-50. The Tombow is probably the one that I use the least. But nevertheless, I do enjoy using the Tombow in this case. I just use it as a blending tool. So between the Tombow, the two highlighters, I'm able to essentially capture the rough transitions, how the light, is captured on her face and blending in everything together. And I try to get this done before I go back in with this black. Now, this is a step I would say, let's call this step 3, right? In step 3, I really take my time and I go in with the darkest brush pen that I have, which is black in this case, and I depict the strongest lines. And what this will do is it creates almost like an illustrative effect for your drawing. And one of the things I really like about brush pen also is just the versatility, right? This brush pen I'm using in particular, it's actually quite thick and I can create really thick lines with it. But because it also had a very, very thin tip, I'm able to create really delicate and really interesting lines using this brush pen. I have sped up this process for you, but normally this is the step that I take probably the longest, I would say 5 to 10 minutes. And I like to take my time. I want to make sure now that I'm at this stage, the lines are accurate and the shapes that I draw, they are pretty much permanent, right? It's the darkest shape and these lines are there to stay. They're not going to be, taken lightly. So I need to be fairly confident in the lines I put down using this brush pen. And if you're going through this exercise, I think by now you already went through that loose gestural phase using the lightest highlighter that you have, and you already studied it once more again using the darker highlighter. This is your third try. You already essentially practiced it 3 times at this point. So you should have a really good idea of what exactly you are capturing. So after that step is done, I would say all that's left to do is to add the finishing touches. And what I ended up doing is I go back in using this blue highlighter to just deepen the shadow. Because what I've noticed is the blue on its own is not dark enough, even when overlaying with the orange marker. So once I have the black marker down, I can kind of borrow some of the black ink when I'm going back in with these other highlighters and just move the ink around a little bit to create these darker shades. And that's pretty much it. Hope you enjoyed the demonstration and happy drawing.